Hey there. So this video is just to cover a few key points that we didn't really get to cover in class in our session on researching in the BC Library database. So there's just a couple other things that I wanted to go over, picking up where we left off. And when we left off, we found that searching the title of the short story that we were looking at, Stephen King's The 10 O'Clock People, we found that just by searching the title, we didn't find very much. So we had started to go down the line of researching themes that are exhibited in this story. And we found pretty quickly this book, which is available as an e-version called Cigarettes Are Sublime. And it seemed like this would be a pretty good source. But the issue is when you look around, everything else seems to be kind of medical literature. It looks like it's dealing with data. You can tell by looking at the title of the journal, Journal Education, Health and Sport, Pediatric and Perinatal Epidemiology, so on and so forth. These don't seem like they'll be particularly helpful in terms of exploring the symbolic value of smoking as it exists in Stephen King's story and elsewhere in literature, which is really our concern here. So what do? Are you supposed to just browse through all these thousands and thousands of articles, hoping to just stumble on it? Well, you can filter. One thing you can do is filter out all these medical journals, all these scientific journals, which can be helpful in another context, but not here. So what do? You go over here, and you see that you can set these different filters. So I encourage you to play around with these. There's all kinds of different things you can do. For example, if what you're researching, you're getting a lot of popular sources as opposed to academic sources, then you might want to set this filter so you only get peer-reviewed journal articles. That could be helpful. You might want to only look at articles or only look at books. You see, newspaper articles if you're trying to get some primary sources, what have you. All these different things. Again, just play around and see what works. See what different avenues lead you where. But for our purposes here, we know that we want to get rid of these scientific and science and technology articles, all 232,000 plus of them, and these life sciences and biomedicine. Those aren't really helpful to us in creating an argument about Stephen King's story, The 10 O'Clock People, right? So scroll down and see if any of the filters here work. How about this? Literature. This seems like it could eliminate a lot. That gets us down to 5,350 articles, right? So let's look at that. Let's do that. And then let's see what happens. So we have 18th century pipes and the erasure of the disposable object. That's far too specific in a direction that doesn't really concern us. We're looking at really smoking cigarettes specifically in American culture, ideally within the context of 90s American culture, which is when the story was written. At least for starters, you can move away, you can broaden the conversation as your research dictates. But you want to start pretty specific at first. Marijuana, that doesn't really concern us. We're talking about cigarettes, right? So we have other kinds of smoking. Here we go, the same book. This concerns Southern literature. That's not helpful, but this is the same book we already had. Maybe helpful. This one seems like it might be helpful right away, just because it says cultural studies and addiction, right? And the people in the book and the characters in the 10 O'Clock People, they're not simply smokers. They're sort of struggling. They're in the in between ground of not quite being able to give up their addiction to cigarettes, but they've made some progress in that way. They know it's not particularly healthy, and they know there's health consequences and whatnot. And this seems to be exploring that idea from a cultural angle. So this right away seems like it might be helpful. It's a book, we can see that right away, and it's worth checking out. It's available online. You get a little description here. High Anxieties explores the history and ideological ramifications of the modern concept of addiction. So that's a check. That sounds good. We have addict, addiction. So all the 10 o'clock people are essentially addicts, right? Nicotine addicts. So it's a collection of essays. That sounds promising. This breaks down the essays, the psychology of addiction, opium, that doesn't sound particularly helpful. Alcohol abuse, that doesn't sound helpful, although it would be helpful in other Stephen King stories. He deals a lot with alcohol abuse. Alcoholics Anonymous, not so much. This isn't really helpful, but here we go. Smoking, right? So this talks about smoking in pop culture. So right away, I think it would be worth jotting down this as a good probable source. It doesn't mean you should go in and read it now, but just make a note of it. You can come back to it later and look at it more fully. Right now, you're just trying to get some coordinates, right? Mark your paths, as it were, your pathways of inquiry. So it would be worth jotting down this title and keeping that. So we have a few, if you remember back to the other session, the other video, you can watch the other recording, we're up to about 4 or 5 probably useful sources at this point. All right, so if you're doing your annotated bibliography, you can kind of be halfway there, possibly. Of course, you'd have to go back in and look at these sources a little bit more closely, examine them, read them a little bit more in depth, and see if they actually are helpful, get some idea what they're actually saying, the nuance of what they're saying. But we have good possibilities at this point. All right, so you can keep following that same line of inquiry, smoking, that theme, you can keep going down. You can also try at this point a different keyword, maybe instead of smoking, you could try cigarettes literature, see what happens. Again, you have all these medical journals. You want to get rid of those, so go over to your filters. Go down, see what kind of filters you can set. See if there's anything that says humanities, cultural studies, literature, fiction. Let's try that, fiction. Maybe American literature, let's set that. And maybe popular culture, since it is Stephen King. And there's other different ones, but let's start there, right? Let's see what comes up. So there's that same book again that we saw previously, and decided it might be a good source. So these books, first of all, this looks like it's probably actual literature. It looks like it's possibly fiction, right? So it's a novel. That's not really helpful. But the other thing is, you can see that even if this did seem like it could be a helpful book, a cultural study, you see that it's not available as an e-version. It's only available as a hard copy in the BC library, which, due to present circumstances, that doesn't really help you very much. Now, if things were normal, if you saw a book that was helpful and it said this, available at BC Library Stacks, then you'd want to actually go to the physical library and see if you could find that book and flip through the index and look at the intro and so on and so forth and see if it might be helpful. But I'm not expecting anyone to do that because of obvious reasons. So let's see, do we have anything? This is about Raymond Carver, probably not too useful. Let's load some more. Let's just follow this a little bit farther. None of these seem. The cigarette style accessory, okay. So we have cultural analysis of cigarettes, the paper cigarettes. these things are potentially interesting, but at this point in the research, you just keep skipping over them. What about this? This seems interesting for the simple reason that it's responding to a source that we already decided might be potentially useful. So let's see what's going on here. Let's open that up. All right, so we have an abstract. You can skim in a little bit. Generation warnings mentioned. Australia, like smoking reduces your fitness. Kind of a fragmented abstract. Smoking as a social marker, related middle class. So it's incorporating the idea of class into the symbolism of smoking, the cultural significations of smoking. So we see this as pretty current as well, because you can see it talks about vaping. All right, so it doesn't seem like there's anything directly useful maybe here about the 10 o'clock people, but you might go down a little bit farther. This would definitely be worth taking a note of this article. Write down the title, take down the name of the author, but maybe just save it for later. Maybe don't even bother to go too in depth into it right now, just based on that abstract. It doesn't seem immediately helpful. But the thing is that since it's responding to the Klein book, Cigarettes Are Sublime, if that does prove to be a useful source, then what you're trying to do ultimately is to take part in the conversation. So you can see that there's already a dialogue happening, and you're trying to, if you do use that other book, then you probably want to come back and look at this as well and actually read it more in depth and just see what seems to be a counter argument might exist, and see what the direction of the conversation is. And then once you have an idea of the framework, the architecture of the conversation, then you can take your interpretation of the 10 o'clock people, you can take that story and you can plug it into the conversation that's already happening. So even if nowhere in this particular conversation is the 10 o'clock people mentioned, you can take the ideas that are already being bounced around and apply them to the 10 o'clock people and just kind of see what happens, explore that dynamic. So that's kind of when I talk about coming in through the side door, that's what I'm talking about. Seeing how you can plug different conversations into one another, bridge different conversations, different discourses, see what connections you can make. All right, so I would take note of that, but I wouldn't bother to read it in depth now. Just know that it's there, leave your trail of breadcrumbs, and you could come back to it later. So again, you can keep following you can keep following this line of inquiry about the theme of the story. Or at this point, what I would do is go to the other line of inquiry, which was suggested by Sanjar, I believe, which would be to use the author's name. Right. So I'd want to come back to this pathway of thought, this train of thought, and keep exploring. But right now, I just want to get an idea of the lay of the land. I want to see what's out there. I want to see what different. I don't need to walk the whole path right now. I just need to know that that path is there. So I know that there are things written about significations of smoking and cigarettes in literature. I know that's there, right? I don't need to go down it fully right now. I can come back. I have a few possibly useful sources. You can refer to one of the other video commentaries that I made about using books, researching with books, and that can give you some pointers about how to find more sources with these books and these articles. Even if this book is in itself useful, there's ways. Even if it's not directly useful, there's ways that it could be indirectly useful by using things like the index to get more keywords, or the bibliography at the end of this book to find other sources that might be directly useful, or at least more directly useful. As we found, there's not a lot that is directly written about the 10 o'clock people. So you might try the author's name at this point, see what comes up. So the first thing you see is that you get all of the novels and story collections that are actually written by Stephen King. You don't really want to deal with those right now. Potentially at a later stage, you might want to incorporate some of his other texts, but it's a 7 to 10 page research paper what you're doing, so you want to keep it pretty tight. So you want to get rid of that. So just to get started, I would get rid of those books and just look at articles. Click on that, see what happens. You get rid of all those novels. All right, so you have articles, but the problem is now you see you have like a physics journal written by another man named Stephen King. That's definitely not useful in this context. That has absolutely nothing to do with Stephen King or even literature at all, right? So you want to get rid of those. You want to get rid of this physicist named Stephen King. Right? He seems to have published in different places, different physics journals. So you want to get rid of him. And the way to do that is to go back into the filters. Let's see. Let's try Stephen King is in English literature. It's written in English, but I wouldn't go straight to English literature. I would go to just literature. See what happens. You get 7,000. Yeah, I think I would start there. Just keep it small. See what happens. Apply that filter. All right. So we have The Shining and the media conglomerate. It's about The Shining, obviously. Probably not too useful right off the bat. Authorial persona from print to digital environments. Let's see. This is about Stephen King, possibly about Stephen King representing himself within his own text. Let's see. This paper aims to foreground contemporary socio-cultural conditions which have reconfigured authorship in relation to the materiality of the product through the example of Stephen. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to tell what this is about. Here we go, description. So we have the convergence of literary practices with computer information technologies has immensely affected writing processes and theories of authorship. This paper aims to foreground I don't think this is probably immediately helpful. I would shy off of this for now. Maybe make a mental note depending on where your research takes you. But this is about the authorial persona of Stephen King. Which you can make an argument about, but this seems to be going off in a different direction. Stephen King, he was a smoker. He was an alcoholic, so he knows about addiction and all this. So there's ways you could talk about the 10 o'clock people as being representative of certain events in the life of Stephen King, but this seems like it's going off in another direction. So I wouldn't bother with this right now. I'd jump back into the pool, see what's there, throw that fish back. So this is about The Shining adaptation. We have more about The Shining, Monsters from the Id. So we have all kinds of different stories here. All right, so none of this seems directly useful yet. So I'd go back up, look over it again, see if anything re-represents itself. But I'd go and I'd apply another filter. Or how about you could try this? You could try, let's say, if you want to take it for granted that the 10 o'clock people is a commentary on consumerism in American culture, and the cigarettes in the 10 o'clock people are representative of American consumerism. So then you might try the author name and the theme. Let's try Stephen King and consumerism. All right, you want to put the name in quotes. Try that. All right, and go over to your resource type, your filters. Turn on articles. Let's see, topic. Let's do literature. Let's do American literature. So you have all this. This is about different authors. This doesn't seem useful. Where is Stephen King? Let's find our guy. So that's about Stephen King, but about a different story. So again, we know that there's not a lot written about the 10 o'clock people, but we want to find something that is at least talking about themes that are covered, similar themes that might be covered in other stories by Stephen King. All right, so not a whole lot there. Let's do Stephen King again. See, let's try some different filters. So the articles. Let's try fiction and American literature. All right, so we have this is about adapting Stephen King, it looks like, or about Stephen King's directorial effort with Maximum Overdrive. Probably not helpful channel. So we have about as we mentioned in class, Stephen King kind of walks this line between popular and more high literary culture, however you want to say it. This is about a film. It's about Carrie. We don't see anything that seems to be touching on similar themes. This looks like it might be useful because the Bat people are aliens, right? Presumably. So this is talking about aliens in the work of Stephen King. This is about alien possession tales. Let's see. Let's have a look. So Stephen King's work, highly informed and influenced by sci-fi traditions of the 50s and 60s, often fuses these sensibilities with the genre for which it has become known, horror. Go down to the description. It's about Tommyknockers and Dreamcatcher, two other novels. All right, that doesn't look particularly helpful either. So this is part of it, right? You're going to have a lot of misses. All right, so here we have Stephen King and sci-fi. Maybe make a brief mental note of that, but come back to it. What about this? Disturbing Appetites. This looks like it might be interesting. So it's about a completely different novel, the novel Thinner. But we have this food fatness in 1980s American culture and Stephen King's Thinner. So even though this is about a completely different book, we see that this is somehow possibly touching on the theme of American consumerism in the works of Stephen King. So this might be worth looking at. Open it up. So you have food symbolism. So again, we're dealing with cigarettes, but with the 10 o'clock people, we're dealing with cigarettes, but you can assume that there might be certain parallels between the way that King is going after the consumption of food in America with cigarettes, right? It's possible anyway. It's worth looking at. So let's open it up. So kind of look over the first paragraph here. So we already know it's talking about Thinner. It's summarizing Thinner. So we have kind of a summary. So this is good. It's talking about through lines that go across a number of Stephen King's works. All right, so here we go. There's a keyword we're looking for. The dangers of addiction and excess more broadly. All right, so that should set up a flag. All right, so we can make parallels here, right? If it's about consumption, in a way, maybe you could make some kind of argument about, or not even a central argument, but you can make some kind of parallel between the idea of quitting smoking and dieting or something like that. That's enough for now. This would be worth noting down. And possibly coming back to. So note down the title, the author, maybe the name of the journal, the platform perhaps, and come back to that later. So you can see we're up to about 5 or 6 solidly potential sources, right away. So altogether that took, I don't know, let's say 2 hours, right, to get about 6 sources, 6 likely sources. And you'll, depending on what you're writing about, it might go even quicker, right? You could get, and again, you'd have to go back and read those sources, but we've set up our, as I said, our trail of breadcrumbs. We know where to go back to. We know the pathways of thought, the trains of thought that we can follow, and maybe find some gold, find some useful tidbits of commentary that we can incorporate into our own argument. So it's really about that. Ultimately, you have to try all kinds of different things, different filters, different keywords, exploring different themes, different keywords of theme in relation to the author's name, in relation to the title of the work that you're going after, you know, all kinds of different things. You'll have to find what works for you ultimately, right? So there's a few tips that can work, a few guidelines, but ultimately you have to just do it. You have to get in there, get dirty in the Beast Library database and see what you can find. The deeper you dig, the more interesting an argument you can craft, and that's really what you're trying to do, is to create something that is interesting and that someone would be intrigued to read. All right, and I look forward to reading what you come up with very much.